No, no.
Berry. Cerrito de mala. Oh, pero hace ese puchito.
Cable.
Yo tengo operación. Claro, pero yo no sabía.
Go.
Está hecho.
No, not yet. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, hello everyone, it's great to be back speaking at Ekoparty, because the last time I spoke here was in 2017, and the topic of my presentation back then was actually Industroyer. And today, believe it or not, the talk is going to be somewhat of a sequel to that. I'll talk about Industroyer 2. I'll do a recap of Industroyer, the original version. But it's not going to be the only thing we'll cover. So we'll take a closer look at the broader topic of the cyberwar that we've been seeing unraveling in Ukraine, with a primary focus on the Cyberwar APT group, but also a little bit about some others as well. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Robert Lipovsky. I'm a principal threat intelligence researcher for ESET. I lead one of the ESET threat research teams in HQ in Bratislava, Slovakia. The role of our team is primarily to track APTs. And when I say primarily, I mean mostly, but not exclusively. So we also follow notable cybercriminal developments as well. So, but today's talk is going to be focusing on APTs. So here's the list of the most notable APT groups, in my opinion, that have carried out targeted campaigns against Ukraine over the years. Bear in mind that even this is not a comprehensive list, and we're going to put the spotlight on one of these groups. We'll focus on, in my opinion, the most aggressive of these groups, the one behind the power grid attacks, and that is Sandworm. So Sandworm has been attributed to the Russian Military Intelligence Service, the GRU, and in October 2020, the FBI even released a public indictment of the 6 GRU hackers for taking part in some of the attacks we're going to be discussing in just a second. By the way, in case you're wondering where the name Sandworm comes from, well, here's the answer. In some of the early campaigns that were actually using the Black Energy malware, we discovered these text strings in the command and control addresses. So apparently the operators were fans of Frank Herbert's classic. We first talked about these Dune references at the Virus Bulletin conference in 2014, but it was actually Eyesight Partners, now under Mandiant, that coined the Sandworm moniker. And if you're interested in the whole story, I do encourage you to read Andy Greenberg's book on various Sandworm campaigns. It's a really good read. So we've been tracking this APT group from basically the beginning, since Black Energy evolved from a cyber criminal commodity piece of malware to a cyber weapon in the hands of this APT group. And the earliest Sandworm traces in our telemetry date back to 2011, and here's a decoy document that was being used at the time, referencing a conference that would be happening at the beginning of the following year. Then, towards the end of 2013, we observed a notable increase in targeted APT activity against Ukrainian high-profile targets. And if we take a look at the geopolitical situation and developments around the time, so you can see that this was preceding the Russian occupation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Donbass. Sandworm targeted all types of organizations, including government, diplomatic, media, transportation, and even Ukrainian elections. One of the main methods that they would use to infiltrate these organizations would be through carefully crafted, highly targeted spear phishing emails. And here's one example that even uses the war in Donbass as a lure. I'm not going to do a little translation of that, but the email basically says that the Ukrainian Prime Minister is instructing various state institutions to check every parliament member and members of other organizations for supporting separatists in the East. And in the attachment, there was a PowerPoint presentation with a list of these alleged separatist supporters. So I think we can all agree that this is really good social engineering. This isn't like your typical Nigerian print scam. And in the background, it would lead to the download and installation of the Black Energy malware from the attacker's remote server. Moreover, this was actually exploiting a zero-day vulnerability in PowerPoint. That was CV 2014-4114. So this meant that the recipients of these emails could have been compromised, even if they had the fully patched versions of Windows in Office. So Black Energy was used in many campaigns against many organizations, but definitely the most notable attack, and the one that caught the attention of the global cybersecurity industry, was the one against the Ukrainian power grid, which culminated in December 2015 when it became the first ever blackout caused by a cyber attack. And I specifically choose the word culminated because, I mean, that was just the end game, the visible part of the attack, which was obviously preceded by initial access, lateral movement, reconnaissance, and all that, and that actually preceded this end goal in December by many months prior to that. So this attack was facilitated by Black Energy, and again, I choose my words pretty carefully, because Black Energy didn't cause the blackout directly. So it facilitated the attack, and the attack was carried out in a coordinated manner against multiple electric distribution companies in various regions of the country. These companies are called Obl Energos, from the word Obl, Oblast, meaning region in Ukrainian. So the attackers misuse remote access software, radmin specifically, to manually switch off the flow of electricity, and then as a result of that, the homes of around 230,000 Ukrainians across different regions in the country went dark for several hours, depending on the region. And here's an infamous video that was leaked, and this was taken by one of the operators at a targeted electric substation. The video is showing the attackers remotely connecting to this workstation, and they're interacting with the SCADA software there, manipulating with the circuit breakers, and in just a second you'll see that the phone tilts below to show that nobody is touching the mouse or the keyboard. Okay, so almost exactly 1 year later, in December 2016, there was another blackout that was again caused by a cyber attack, and this time the attackers really stepped up their game. There were quite a number of differences between this attack and the Black Energy facilitated attack the year prior. In this time, there was only one substation that was hit, but the attackers, they had much higher ambitions. We discovered the malware that they used, that was Industroyer, and unlike the previous year's manual disruption, Industroyer was the first ever malware specifically designed to attack power grids in an automated way. And I'll come back to that later when we do a closer recap of how Industroyer operated. So in the following years, there was a lot of evolution of the tool set used by Sandworm, and the group sort of split its activities, and we've been tracking them at a fairly granular level. So as you've seen, Black Energy, Cluster, Industroyer, Telebots, Malware, Gray Energy. So around this time, we've seen them split into the Gray Energy cluster, which continued attacks against the energy sector, primarily in Ukraine, but also in Poland, for example. And the Telebots cluster, which carried out attacks mainly against the financial sector in Ukraine. And Telebots was also the subgroup behind the infamous NotPetya outbreak in June 2017. Now, obviously, there's no need to go into detail on what became the most devastating, the most costly cyber attack in history. I just want to tip my virtual hat to Anton Cherepanov in my team, who discovered two important things about the NotPetya epidemic. First was its origin, or the patient zero, if you will, and pinpointed down to a supply chain compromise of the EmiDoc software company creating the vendor creating the EmiDoc software being the most popular tax filing and economical software used throughout the country. And through that, effectively made the attribution link that NotPetya was the work of Sandwar. Then in 2018, we discovered a telebots backdoor that we called Exeramel, and this was a really significant discovery because after 1.5 years, this was the first hard bit of evidence for attributing Industroyer to Sandwar based on code similarity. Now, I mean, obviously, all of us folks in the industry were thinking, I mean, Industroyer was probably the work of Sandwar. I mean, it makes sense based on the developments that we've been seeing, based on the black energy attack before. But until this discovery of Exeramel, there was no actual public evidence, any hard proof to support those hypotheses. And then in the following years, we saw sandworm attacks in Ukraine, but also in other countries. So there was Olympic Destroyer in Korea, there was Gray Energy in Poland, Sandtime in Georgia and Turkey, there was Exeramel discovered in France. And this basically answers a question that obviously comes to mind when talking about the cyber war in Ukraine, whether these sandworm attacks can affect other countries outside of Ukrainian borders. So the answer to that is obviously yes, it has happened in the past, and we need to be on the lookout and prepared for such attacks in the future as well. Anyway, the GRU attackers continue to be active throughout these years, but the most notable attacks that you can see on the timeline really date between 2015 and 2017, and they haven't been creating headlines in the years after that. So they did continue to be active, but really kept a much lower profile, well, until now. So on February 23rd this year, just before 5 p.m. Ukrainian local time, which was just a few hours before the Russian military invasion, we detected hermetic wiper attacks in Ukraine. Now, obviously not expected what would happen the next morning, but with the escalation, with the geopolitical situation happening, with the Russian army stationed at the Ukrainian border, it was really tense, and we felt that this discovery shouldn't be limited to our threat intel customers only, but we wanted to share with the community, hence this Twitter feed, and it was a really long night, and I mean, Jax is here, then he can corroborate that as well. So hermetic wiper, what was this about? So we detected it on hundreds of systems in multiple Ukrainian organizations, and it was a pure act of cyber sabotage. So it was trying to render these computers unbootable and effectively any public-facing services that they might be running inaccessible. It was just the first in a series of wipers we discovered in Ukraine since February. And in these various wipers, their technical level actually varied quite a lot. Hermetic wiper was actually one of the more advanced ones. I'll just point out one notable feature. So it was abusing a driver of a legitimate disk partitioning software, EaseUS, for its low-level file system operations. The compilation timestamp suggests that the malware was prepared at least several months before it was deployed. Now, hermetic wiper wasn't the only malicious code used in this campaign. There were other components co-deployed alongside with it. There was this worm component, which we're calling Hermetic Wizard, which was being used to spread the malware across the network. And then there was Hermetic Ransom, another FAW ransomware, just like NotPetya was. By the way, one of the components in Hermetic Wizard was named Romance DLL, so an evident reference to the Eternal Romance exploit, even though no exploits were actually used in this campaign. Now, if you think about it for a moment, it is kind of strange to deploy a wiper and a decoy ransomware, which are essentially the same thing, right, in one single campaign. Moreover, when Hermetic Ransom was even poorly written with a lot of bugs and programming errors, in contrast to a Hermetic Wiper. So a possible explanation for that is that the malware was being deployed through group policy. So machines would download it at different times as they were being turned on. And the attackers probably tried to deploy this Hermetic Ransom that they pulled out of the shelf at this point after we were detecting and blocking Hermetic Wiper. And here's the ransom message displayed by Hermetic Ransom after encrypting the files. And here are some Easter eggs found in the code. Okay, moving forward, on March 14th, we discovered another wiper. This time, we're calling it Caddy Wiper. And I'm not going to go into the technical details, and obviously I'm also not covering all of the wiper attacks. We found quite a few since February, as I mentioned. But Caddy Wiper was notable because we later saw it again in the Industroyer 2 incident. So this March 14th attack targeted organizations in the financial sector. And from a technical point of view, it wasn't too interesting. One notable thing that I will point out is that it was avoiding destroying data on domain controllers to retain access inside the organizations while still disrupting their operations. Now on to the events of April 8th. So we were contacted by the Ukrainian CERT to help them respond to a cyber incident at an energy provider in the country and help them analyze a suspicious piece of malware. And our analysis found out that the threat was bigger than expected because it was a new version of Industroyer. Now, on a positive note, while the first Industroyer incident caused a blackout with a duration of about 1 hour, this latest one didn't even accomplish that. The attack was thwarted thanks to a prompt response by the defenders at the targeted Energo company, CertUA, and our assistance. But although no blackout took place, it was still a huge deal. Had the attack been successful, then potentially more than 2 million people could have been left in the dark, since the targeted Obol Energo is the provider of electricity in a region with that many people. So in my opinion, this has been the most significant cyber attack during the war thus far, even if unsuccessful. So now let's take a closer look at how Industroyer worked and what makes it unique. First, looking at the first version. So it really is unique because as I said, it's the first malware designed specifically to attack power grids in an automated way, and at the same time, it's the second ever malware deployed to cause physical damage to industrial hardware, the first being Stuxnet and the third being Triton later after it. So Industroyer's first main goal was to de-energize power lines, to open circuit breakers at a preset time using its payload modules, and I'll take a closer look at the architecture in just a second. Then, second, it would wipe SCADA software so that the operators couldn't see the status of the environment, couldn't control it. That was the purpose of this wiper component, and this component was noteworthy. I mean, remember, Sandworm, as you probably noticed, it has this really long history of wiping and destructive malware ever since Black Energy plugins and various kill disk variants and so on. So this module specifically wipes files belonging to SCADA software, some of which you can see listed on the slide there. And then it would render the control station unbootable by corrupting the registry and finally crashing that machine by killing all the processes. So Industroyer's third impact point would be its attempt to take out protection relays. Now, these protection relays, they play a really important role in electric grid operations. As the name suggests, they protect the grid from harmful conditions. And if they were to be disabled, then the grid could become vulnerable. And that impact was the purpose of this denial of service module, which was supposed to exploit a vulnerability in Siemens Cybertech devices by sending a specially crafted UDP packet to port 50,000. This would switch the protection relay into a firmware update mode where it would be stuck. So effectively, it wouldn't be doing its job. Now, then the utility operators would try to restore the power, and they would do so by reclosing the breakers manually, by switching to a manual mode of operations. Now, with the protective relays, if these were disabled in the previous step, the grid could become unstable and possibly lead to physical damage of hardware. And had this been successful, then obviously the outage that was caused in the initial de-energization could have lasted much longer than the 1 hour that it did. So all in all, the Russian had high ambitions with this Industroyer attack, but they ultimately failed, part because of better resilience of the Ukrainian defenders, and part because of coding mistakes that were found in the Industroyer implementation. So here's a quick overview of the architecture. Industroyer is a modular, let's call it, framework. There was this launcher component. I'm not going to go into detail of all of the components, just mention some of the more important ones. And the role of the launcher component was it was responsible for the timing of the attack. So there was this hard-coded timestamp when it would launch these payload modules to open those circuit breakers. And these payload modules that you can see there were 4 of them, and they were implementing these 4 different industrial communication protocols: IEC 101, IEC 104, 61850, and OPCDA. Therefore, most of these were implemented as DLLs, and each of them had their own configuration files. I'm going to focus on IEC 104, as that's the protocol that's also used by Industroyer 2. So this protocol, it's basically a network extension of IEC 101. It's a telecontrol protocol used in power grids. It's really extensive, and we're not going to go into the details. The problem with this protocol is that it was designed decades ago without focusing on security. I mean, there is no authentication whatsoever. It operates in a client-server model where the control station is the client and the remote station is the server. And what the malware is doing, what Industroyer is doing, is that it's creating and transmitting these ASDU messages to change the state of the remote station IOAs. That's important for you to remember. IOA stands for Information Object Address, and it's flipping the state of these IOAs to off. Now, what those IOAs map to exactly depends on the configuration in the substation environment. And here's a dummy configuration. So Industroyer would create these telegrams based on this configuration. The reason why I say dummy is because the actual configuration used in that attack was not recovered. It was wiped with the wiper component. So as you can notice here, it can target multiple stations. It's spawning concurrent threads. And just highlighting some of the members there. So there's the station IP and the port. The process of a legitimate SCADA application to kill to avoid conflict. It also supports console output and also logging. And this basically illustrates the operation. So for example, it's sending these off commands to a range of IOAs from 10 to 15. Okay, now let's take a look at the new version, the latest Industroyer 2, and compare and contrast it with the original. So there is a lot of code similarity, and we can definitely say that it evolved from the same source code. There are notable differences in architecture, though, where Industroyer 2 is a self-contained executable compared to the original, which was this modular framework that I showed earlier. And it only implements the IOC 104 protocol. So since it's self-contained, then also the configuration isn't in standalone configuration files, but it's embedded within that one binary, which effectively means that for various deployments, the operators would have to, and various deployments with different configurations, the operators would have to recompile it each time. So we analyzed 2 samples with different configurations. Both of these samples appear to be compiled on March 23rd. Of course, this is just the compilation, which was preceded by the coding and the reconnaissance and all of that. And we have indication that they were in the network of this Obel Energo since at least mid-February, so even before the actual military invasion. So the new configuration format is stored as a hard-coded string. Industroyer 2 can communicate with multiple devices at once, similarly to its predecessor. With the 2 samples we analyzed, one contained 8 different IP addresses of devices, and the other one contained 3, and that's the one you can see on this slide here. The configuration contains values that are used during the communication through this IEC 104 protocol, like ASDU addresses, IOAs, stuff like that. And if we look at this one particular offset here, so you can see that it has the similar stuff that you saw with the earlier Industroyer original. So there's the station IP, the port, whether it should operate in this range mode. There's this targeted process that it's trying to terminate, similarly to before. So this is a legitimate process that's used in standard daily operations at that utility, and it's killing that in order to avoid conflict with that. Moreover, it would rename that executable of that application to prevent automatic restart of that process. Then it lists the IOAs that it should target. Those you can see there. Then there's also other things like timeouts and stuff like that. In the samples we analyzed, so one of the samples contained 110 IOAs that were specified, and the other one contained 68 IOAs. And I'll come back to that in the recap why that's important. So if we compare this format of the configuration with the configuration of the original Industroyer, we can see that it basically contains the same stuff, just in a different format. And when that is executed, here's what that configuration would kind of look like if we would to convert it to a more human readable form. So basically, you can see that it's sending these double commands and sending this off command to this range of specified IOAs. Now, the obvious question is, what do these IOAs do? And as I mentioned earlier, it's a question that's fairly hard to answer because the IOA might mean something different from utility to utility. It really depends on the used equipment, the setting, configurations, and all that stuff. If we Google one of these IOAs, we stumble upon this documentation from ABB. And some of these IOAs belong to a circuit breaker failure protection. So the Industroyer 2 sample may have been trying to turn off this protection device. So this screen shows the similarity between the code, between the old version and the new one. As you can see, there are the same, some of the same string constants, similar code fragments being used. I'll leave that up for just a second so you can compare that. And here's the console output. It changed as well. Before it was more verbose. It was clean and even colorful. The newer version is a lot less clear. They're using some error codes instead of text and stuff like that. Now, similar to the Industroyer incident in 2016, in the Industroyer 2 attack, there was also additional malware co-deployed to amplify the impact of the disruption. Specifically, this was, again, no surprise, being done through wipers, with the intention to make the recovery more difficult and also to cover the attacker's tracks and to thwart post-incident investigation. So there were, again, different flavors of wipers. There was Caddy Wiper, again, for Windows, and there was Orc Shred, Solo Shred, and Awful Shred, targeting machines with Linux and Solaris operating systems, all of these implemented in Bash. What's interesting is that Orc Shred is actually a worm, and it's trying to connect to all hosts reachable on the network through SSH, and then it would try credentials from a list, and then would try to run the wipers. Here's the timeline of the incident. So the attackers used scheduled tasks to execute malware after the deployment, and that's what enabled us to reconstruct and know when exactly the Cyberwar operators wanted to perform this attack. So just 2 minutes before 4, this is all Ukrainian local time, they would deploy Caddy Wiper on some Windows machines in that network, and the Linux and Solaris malware as well. Then 4 minutes later, they would create that scheduled task to launch Industroyer 2. Then at 5:10 was the scheduled execution of Industroyer 2 to de-energize the grid. And then 10 minutes after that, there was the scheduled execution of Caddy Wiper on the same machine as Industroyer 2 to erase its traces. So in order to the scheduled task, the Linux wipers were also using cron to launch themselves at a specific time. And you can see that this script is trying to launch the different type of wiper based on the operating system, either Linux or Solaris. So Caddy Wiper, as I mentioned when I was describing the March 14th incident, the wiper itself is relatively unremarkable. So it's wiping the C user's directory and then the whole drives from D onwards, overwriting files with zeros. Then it's corrupting the partition table, making the machine unbootable. But perhaps more noteworthy than the loader, more noteworthy than the wiper itself, is the loader that it was being used to load it. And that's called argu-patch, and it took the form in this campaign as a small piece of code that was inserted into the remote debugger of IDA Pro. Now, take a moment to think about that. I mean, typically when malware takes the form of a legitimate binary, it's for masquerading purposes, right? But IDA isn't used at an electric substation. I mean, we researchers use it to analyze malware. So the only way that I translate it is that the attackers are trolling us. And this was then later confirmed in a later campaign when we saw argu-patch again. And this time they were using an ESET executable stripped of its signature as its host file. And even in this later campaign, argu-patch was still being used to deploy Caddy Wiper. And we believe that Sandworm is actively leaking information stolen during these campaigns, so leaking them on Telegram. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about defense and highlight a couple of opportunities to detect this activity. So in addition to endpoint detection software, first, we released some PCAPs that contain the captured network traffic produced by the Industroyer 2 samples. They're up on our GitHub. You can play around with them. You can research yourself. In addition to that, we released a snort rule that can be used to detect this network traffic. And the idea behind that rule is to detect these single or double commands to important IOAs, like the failure protection that I mentioned. But there are a few limitations to this approach. Like, it's not always possible to monitor the network in this IoT environment. Also, you need to identify the IOAs which should be monitored, and when the rule is triggered, it's actually already too late. So that's why we suggest another approach, and that is to detect the lateral movement and the earlier stages of the attack. So I'm guessing most of you are familiar with Impacket, so it's this open source framework with these implementations of various network protocols in Python. And there are these tools built on top of this framework, and they're used for remote execution and lateral movement, among other things. And Impacket is heavily used by Sandworm, especially this wmi.exe.py. And we can detect when wmi.prvsc exe spawns a new command exe, as this has this specific command line that's being used. And as a bonus, you can also use this technique to detect other APTs, not only Sandworm. And Sandworm has also been using a custom PowerShell script that creates those scheduled tasks via the Active Directory group policy. And there's a whole dedicated MITRE-ATT&CK sub-technique for these scheduled tasks, and you can follow the recommendations there to monitor for specific event IDs. Now, as a side note, something something to think about. So there's actually a Metasploit client for IEC 104. And if the attackers would want to carry out this whole attack manually, they could have just sent those ASDU telegrams through a remote shell using something like this. So effectively what Industroyer, and this applies to both versions, so what it's doing is putting all this capability into a package. So the gist of the attack was in the attacker's deep knowledge of the environment. They knew the IPs, they knew the specific IOAs to target. I mean, as you've seen in the configuration, like they had them hard-coded, they knew what they were going after. And that brings me to the wrap for this Industroyer section of the talk. Here's some further reading for you in case you're interested in more details. There's our blog posts on it. There are 2 good write-ups by Mandiant and Nozomi Networks that provide nice documentation of the Industroyer 2 configuration. And Joe Slowick put out a white paper that goes into detail on the physical destruction goal in the Industroyer 2016 incident. Now, all of this really is just the tip of the iceberg. As I mentioned several times in the talk, there were many, many more campaigns, and there were many other attacks by both Sandworm and the other APT groups as well, some of which have also been attributed to Russian 3-letter agencies, including the GRU like Sandworm, but also SVR and the FSB. So for Sandworm, I showed the FBI indictment, and I want to spend a few minutes on another APT group, that's Gamaredon. And for Gamaredon, the Ukrainian Secret Service, the SBU, published details about them. They're calling the group Armageddon. And this report from November 2021 is really interesting, and I strongly encourage you to read it. It's linking Gamaredon to an FSB unit operating out of occupied Crimea. And they're publishing a lot of information about the actual people, the individuals behind this group, their roles, and even some captured phone calls that they were making during these operations. So this really gives us a unique opportunity to hear about Gamaredon or an APT group operations from the inside. Now, I'm not going to highlight any one particular Gamaredon campaign. I just want to point out how active the group has been. What they lack in sophistication, well, at least compared to Sandworm, they definitely make up for in volume, because we've been detecting attacks by Gamaredon almost on a daily basis in the past couple of years. So this makes it by far the most active APT group in Ukraine. And their primary targets have been government organizations. So they're literally spamming their targets with pretty low-tech malware. Their tool set is composed of downloaders, backdoors, basically multiple components executed in multiple stages in various forms. So they use LNK files in our archives, VBS scripts, and recently and more increasingly PowerShell scripts. So what's very specific to Gammaridon and their toolset, which we're calling as Pterodo, is that they're constantly updating their tools. First, of course, in order to try to avoid detection, and also to make the analysis more difficult, more time-consuming. But these changes, they're mostly superficial rather than functional. So, for example, they would add a lot of comments, junk code, and stuff like that. An example that we've seen recently was that in order to avoid domain name block lists, Gammaridon recently started using a third-party service, ipapi.com, for resolving the IP addresses of its CNC servers instead of just using regular DNS. In a similar manner, some Gammaridon tools were using Telegram channels to get the IP addresses of their command and control servers. Now, in many instances, we observed that the victims that were compromised by Gammaridon were, let's say, upgraded to a more sophisticated and a much stealthier APT, Invisible, if they were considered by the attackers interesting enough. So this is really interesting collaboration to what we are tracking as separate APT groups. So let's slowly wrap everything up. What is the role of these cyber operations in this armed conflict? Well, we can split it into two main objectives, the first being espionage, the covert, the silent part. And of course, depending on the target, quite often we've been seeing diplomatic, military organizations being targeted. That can provide strategic or tactical advantage in the conflict. And then the second type of impact was sabotage, disruption, destruction, and also just purely signaling, a demonstration of power of these attackers. Now, there has been a lot of discussions about the effectiveness of this and comparing it to, the kinetic operations. And for multiple reasons, I'd be really careful about evaluating the magnitude and the success rate of these Russian cyber operations in Ukraine. It's great that both the Industroyer attacks have ultimately failed their goals, but still some damage has been caused. So all in all, I would say that the threat should not be hyped, but also, conversely, it should not be downplayed or underestimated. We can say that the threats are serious, but they can be thwarted with proper security measures. What I'm trying to say with all the Industroyer 2 implementation and all of that, the threat actor's sophistication is not really in the malware writing in itself. I mean, it's not using any fancy obfuscation and stuff like that. It really is in the intimate knowledge of the protocols, the targeted environment. They really knew what they were going after. And finally, based on the experience that we've had seeing these operations, we can say that the defense needs to focus on early detection and prevention. So we've been publishing the IOCs. Even in this talk, I included some examples of detection opportunities, but most of those approaches really are reactive. So to stay ahead of these attackers, you need to have endpoint security platforms, EDR, and the typical security solutions in place. So that's it for today. If you're interested in following on our research and you haven't done so, I invite you to follow us on We Live Security, which is our blog post, and our Twitter account, ESET Research. Here are my contact details, and let's open up for some questions if there are any. Thank you.
Si tienen alguna duda, pueden acercarse a los micrófonos.